Hello, students, and welcome to our chapter on psychopharmacology. This puts together a whole lot of other things that we've learned in this class and specifically looks at how different kinds of drugs and chemicals can affect our brain and neurotransmitters and those pathways and systems and all of the different networks that we have in our brain. With that being said, because I have you reading multiple chapters, the lecture is comparatively, for as many pages as you're reading, comparatively shorter. So it's about the same as another lecture, as any other chapter, even though we've got two chapters that I've had you read for learning about the neurobiology of drugs and psychopharmacology. So here are some of the basics of neurotransmitters and drugs and how they affect things. So neurotransmitter synthesis is one thing that drugs can intervene with. So the body creates, or in other words, synthesizes neurotransmitters. So we do that mostly in like our midbrain area. And some drugs can affect this neurotransmitter production, make you produce more, inhibit that production. So they can enhance or inhibit the enzyme chemicals that are needed to then build those neurotransmitters. So essentially, your body has the building blocks for neurotransmitters and it synthesizes them, it puts them together, and then carries it all around your brain to all the areas and all the different neurons that need all of those neurotransmitters. So that is one thing that drugs can intervene with, the actual creation of the neurotransmitters, putting the building blocks together to then be at the final stage of neurotransmitter. And so those are called enzymes, are the chemicals that are put together to be the neurotransmitter. Another thing that drugs can affect in our brain are the neurotransmitter packaging. So if we look at this image here, we see these vesicles. And so some drugs can affect the vesicle function itself. So essentially that can lead to them not packaging it as well, so leaking more neurotransmitters into the synapse than it should, or not. Right? So both of these different ones, the synthesis is making more or less of the neurotransmitter available. The packaging of the vesicles, this means that you can affect how the neurotransmitter is, how much again of that neurotransmitter is in the synaptic cleft. And depending on the chemical, depending on the kind of medicine or the kind of drug that you're using, it might affect one or more of these systems. Another thing that we see very often is neurotransmitter reuptake. So that is basically that vacuuming up of these neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft. Essentially, you can either have some other microglia cells eat those neurotransmitters and get rid of them, kind of recycle those in your body, or you can re-vacuum those up so they're ready to be packaged again and used again. So that reuptake process, if you slow that down or speed it up, it can lead, slowing it down leaves more neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft. Speeding it up makes it so there is less neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft. And depending on the specific drug, those are kind of the main things that they do. The drugs can either influence the synthesis or the creation of those neurotransmitters. If you're making more of the neurotransmitter, then you can have more at the synaptic cleft. The packaging can influence the way the neurons are processing things. So then again, you either have more or less of that neurotransmitter at the synaptic cleft, or the reuptake, again, that vacuuming up of the neurotransmitter, you can prevent that reuptake or make it faster to then have less of the neurotransmitter or more of the neurotransmitter. And your book goes into, well, the two chapters I had you read go into quite a bit of detail on exactly how every given drug affects either the reuptake, the synthesis, the packaging. So definitely review those for the drugs that you're most interested in or the people that you think you'll be caring for the most. So you have an idea of like the major medications and what they're doing within someone's brain. For this lecture slides, we won't go into a ton of detail on all those drugs. We'll give one example of that kind of depth here in this lecture, but we won't go into a ton of detail on all of them. So with this, another thing that we see is that drugs can also bind to neurotransmitters or can take the place of neurotransmitters. They can bind to receptors. So these receptor sites, we've seen them before as we've talked about axon, about neuron structure and function. Essentially, you've got a neurotransmitter. Usually what happens, it comes to this binding site. So a neurotransmitter or hormone and any other molecule that kind of fits or matches with this puzzle piece can start an action potential. So the term for any of those chemicals that can activate an action potential is a ligand. So a drug can be a ligand, it can be a chemical that does this, it can mimic the shape of a neurotransmitter, it can be essentially the same chemical as a neurotransmitter. There's a lot of ways to do this, but this is one way that it's done. Essentially, you have a neurotransmitter because of that drug, you have more of that neurotransmitter in the midst of the synaptic cleft, you have a drug that pretends to be the neurotransmitter, and it opens up the ion channel, which can start an action potential. So that's a pretty common way to do it, to just directly activate those ion channels and start action potentials. And with that, though, you can also block this from happening. So certain molecules will lead to more activation, certain molecules will lead to slower activation, certain molecules will lead to no activation, right? So that's where we get this agonist and antagonist. Agonist makes it so it will more likely activate. So making it more common to activate is the agonist, and the antagonist is making it less likely to activate. So it's kind of like fighting with it. So that's what I think with antagonist is it's fighting with it to not activate. There's also inverse agonist, which prevents the receptor activity, and so there's no activation at all. So it's doing the opposite job in engaging. So, but with that, we can have some drugs are partial, some are full agonists, and we can have a whole range depending on what it does, what it is. So again, this might not necessarily be the drug, it might be influencing the neurotransmitters, but again, any kind of molecule that or hormone that can activate this or antagonize is what we're talking about here, specifically at a receptor site, that binding site. So if you've got an antagonist, it can stop this process from happening, right? Or slow it down. If you've got an inverse agonist, it can stop this process entirely. If it's a partial agonist, you can make it happen a little bit. And if you've got a full agonist, you can have a full activation, more activation of those neurotransmitters. So that is one step in this process, is interfering directly with the receptor cell sites. So those binding sites to activate ion channels very directly. So it's like a lock to a key saying, open the channel versus an antagonist and inverse agonist are like slow down or lock the door kind of thing. So that's one way you can think of this. Is also a little bit longer process to also get those ion channels to open, and this is the G protein coupled receptors. So these are also called metabotropic receptors. So that's why people call them the G protein coupled receptors. It's a lot easier to say. So with this, these are affected by nearby proteins that are opening the ion channel. So you have a neurotransmitter, a hormone, the drug telling this whole big G protein coupled receptor to send some proteins to then tell an ion channel to open. So this is a little bit slower than the direct activation of an ion channel that we were just talking about, activating at the binding site. But usually with drugs that, or chemicals or hormones that are doing this, the effect is slower, but it does tend to last longer. So these are telling the ion channels to stay open or be more active and be more open for a longer time than if you're interfering directly at the binding site, which is what we were talking about just a second ago. So depending on what drug it is, it might be affecting the binding site directly. It can be affecting other nearby proteins that then lead to the ion channel being opened. Another thing is that we see modulators. So a modulator, if you mediation moderation, if you've done that in statistics, it's basically that same concept. It alters the ion channels. And so allosteric modulators bind to a different part of the receptor. So it's not directly opening, it's not the key to the lock opening the ion channel directly. It is the first, let's say you've got a lock with or a door with multiple keys. All right, so maybe you've got one master key that opens all of them at the same time. You could kind of think of that as the direct binding site neurotransmitter comes. It fits it all, opens it all really quickly. Versus these allosteric modulators, they bind to different parts of the receptor. So maybe it's one of the locks up here, but then you still have to open up another lock. So another physical process happens to happen before the whole door can open to that ion channel. That's kind of what it's doing. So it can make it easier for an ion channel to activate or more difficult for an ion channel to activate. So it can kind of make it more sensitive to those other main keys. So, or it can make it less sensitive to those other main keys. And that can be really helpful depending on what you're trying to do. So it's regulating, it's modulating, it's not directly opening the ion channel, but it's making it easier or harder for it to open, make it take more neurotransmitter to open that ion channel, take less neurotransmitter to open that ion channel. So depending on what it is that you're trying to accomplish, any of these given methods might be really useful. So, quick review, because these are the basics of all of the drugs that we're talking about. So you can affect the synthesis or the creation of neurotransmitters, which more or less of them leads to more or less in the synaptic cleft. You can influence the packaging of these neurotransmitters. Based on that, you can lead to more or less in the synaptic cleft. You can make them leak as well so that there is more even without a message to the axon. So it just is leaking out more, which makes it a little more likely that this next cell will activate, which can help with things like plasticity. If it's getting activated more, then it'll make a stronger connection with the presynaptic neuron. Or the reuptake. So block or enhance the reuptake to have more or less of those chemicals, so those ligands, the neurotransmitters, or the hormones in that synaptic cleft. You can influence the ion channels directly at those binding sites, open them with kind of like I was saying, a master key, opening, flinging open the door all at once. You can do that. With that, you can also lock it. You can close that door at those binding sites. You can open it a little bit slowly. You can open it quickly. You can block other neurotransmitters from coming and activating it, so it makes it so there's less activation in the next neuron. Another thing, you can affect other nearby proteins to then go and tell ions, hey, open up. So again, a little slower, the effect lasts longer. Or you can affect those voltage gated channels, those binding sites, to be a little easier to activate or a little slower to activate. So there's a lot of specific ways to do this, and there's a lot of different drugs that can do this in different ways. One of the things that we'll talk about in a little bit is the blood-brain barrier. The reason we have to get so specific is because there's very few molecules that can actually get across that blood-brain barrier to do these kinds of functions. So we're kind of just working with the limitations that we have. We've got the blood-brain barrier to protect our brain from harmful pathogens and things like that. But it does make it difficult to get exactly the chemicals that we might want to activate or deactivate these different kind of processes in the brain. Now that we're clear about all the different ways that the brain uses those drugs and we can affect the neurotransmitters, the synthesis of neurotransmitters, that kind of thing, let's move on to how we get those drugs into our system. So again, these are the basics of kind of covering all of the different ways you can do it, just like we just covered all of the different ways the drugs can affect the brain pretty briefly, but we're not going to dive into every single specific drug. But your book does, so definitely make sure you are reviewing the sections on the specific drugs that you are either most interested in or you're really wanting to learn about because you might be working with populations that are using those. Oral medication is probably the most convenient and common that we do. Just taking some pills, you can drink a liquid. So it is a pretty useful method. You can just do that at home generally, but it's also slow and there's a lot of variability in oral use of medications. So the way that we actually get the drug into our system is after it's passed all the way through our stomach and it's gotten all the way to the small intestine. So the blood capillaries in the small intestine at the portal vein are actually what makes contact with the drug and brings that drug into the bloodstream. So that process can take more than 20 minutes, might take up to an hour. And it also does pass through the liver in this process as well, which can alter the drug. It can metabolize some of that, take it out of the, let's say you take a pill, maybe what's actually getting into your blood is a lot less than what you might expect. Also, different drugs can be really affected by fat and proteins. So the liver does a really good job at breaking down certain molecules and certain kinds of chemicals like fat and proteins. These medicines can also bind differently and have different chemical reactions as it's moving through our digestive tract with fat and proteins. And that's one reason it's so important to like listen to the recommendations for. Do use this with food, don't use this with food, don't use it with dairy, for example. So those are really important so that you don't have those kind of chemical reactions changing the medicine so it doesn't actually do what you want it to do in your body or your brain. So oral use is pretty commonly used though. Next is intravenous. So using a needle to get that drug straight into the bloodstream, you don't have to wait for it to go through the digestive system and get into the small intestines. You just stick a hypodermic needle straight into a vein and you get that drug straight into the bloodstream. So this is, because of that, a lot faster than the other one. So 20 plus minutes for oral medication. 20 plus minutes with oral medication versus a minute or even less with intravenous delivery. So this totally bypasses those digestive systems. That being said, because you're not having that reduction in time and it's not getting into the bloodstream a little slower at a time, it is a lot easier to overdose this way because you're just putting it all straight in, right? So that is a risk factor with intravenous drug administration. Also, it's a little bit higher hazard if your equipment that you're using is not sterile. So you need to have pretty sterile equipment to protect the bloodstream, protect from pathogens, things like that. So that is an additional risk factor. But depending on what you were wanting to do, you might want to do intravenous delivery of drugs. So if you're in a hospital and getting anesthesia, you're probably doing intravenous delivery of that kind of drug versus if you're taking something like an SSRI, you're going to probably be doing that orally. So inhalation is another method for delivering drugs to our body. Essentially, in this kind of case, you are getting the lungs to absorb a smoke or a vapor. So here we see a kid, probably an asthma medication. It might be a steroid that's vaporized too. That's a pretty common way to get those drugs into, especially kids. But essentially, in your lungs, you have pulmonary capillaries, and those are what carry that drug into the circulatory system. So it's a little more direct, a little faster than you get with going through the digestive system with an oral medication, but it's not quite as quick as doing a direct injection for the intravenous use. So this is still quite fast. So a couple minutes, so 1 to 2 minutes or so to inhale those drugs, get them into the bloodstream, and then into your brain or other parts of your body, depending on what kind of drug you're using. So with this, one risk factor here with inhalation is you can inhale other particles that could damage your lungs and airways. So that is a risk factor here. Transdermal drug use is going through the skin. So you put a patch or an ointment on the skin surface, and essentially it diffuses through the skin into the bloodstream, into those capillaries and blood vessels that are under and within your skin. And so that gets into the bloodstream over a long period of time. So this is a very slow onset. You're looking at much longer time for that drug to get into your body. But a positive here is that it tends to last a long time. So you've got a lot of drug on this patch or this patch, and it's sitting there seeping into your system for quite a while. So again, depends on what you want to do. Are you needing to get it really, really fast into the system, or do you want it to last a long time? depending on what you need to do for the neurotransmitters, the systems in your brain, might depend on what kind of way to deliver those drugs. Another one is intranasal. So this is similar to the inhalation. Essentially, here you're inhaling a substance, or you can even apply with, say, like a Q-tip or something into the nasal passage, and it's essentially absorbed through those blood vessels in the nasal cavity and then carried to the circulatory system. So kind of similar to the inhalation where in your lungs it's connected with those capillaries. Just in your nose, you've got those capillaries too. So you can pretty quickly, about the same time as inhalation, 1, 2+ minutes, you can get that into your nose and get that drug into your bloodstream. So another risk here, you can get contaminants that can be irritating or lead to tissue damage in your nose. So that can be a risk here with intranasal delivery of drugs. So with that, that's basically all of the methods that we use. We've got the intravenous, we've got inhalation and intranasal that are a little bit slower. So you've got the quickest with intravenous, then a little bit slower here with a couple minutes. Then oral medications can take about 20 minutes to an hour to start really affecting things in your body. And then transdermal takes many hours to really start to get into the blood system, the circulatory system, but it also lasts quite a long time. So again, it really depends. What is the aim? What is the goal? What are the symptoms that you're trying to influence in all of these processes? And with that, like I alluded to earlier, it is a little bit dependent on the blood-brain barrier. Most molecules anywhere just don't diffuse into the brain. So if they are too big molecularly, so if the molecule itself is too big of a molecule, it won't get passed on. If it's got an electrical charge that's more than its is standard for getting across the blood-brain barrier, won't get across. If it's not fat soluble or lipid soluble, it probably won't get across. So this leads our brain to be pretty protected from a lot of pathogens, which is really good. So only specific nutrients, only specific kinds of molecules can pass through that blood-brain barrier because it uses active and passive transport to get those specific kinds of nutrients, molecules, chemicals across that blood-brain barrier. So that means with these drugs, there might be other things we could potentially use to affect the neurotransmitter, but they wouldn't get across the blood-brain barrier. Maybe they're too big of a molecule, they have a charge that is not compatible, or they are also not lipid soluble. So your book gives some examples of different things like that. Like that's why we don't take insulin as a like orally. We don't take insulin orally because the body will break down those chemicals. It won't actually get to the brain. So you've got to do shots of insulin, for example. But yeah, that's one of the kind of challenges we're working with trying to get medicine and these chemicals to the brain. There's a very limited set of things that can get past that blood-brain barrier, which is good. It really helps protect us from a lot of potential problems, but it does also make it hard to get a medicine that we might want to the brain. All right, so that is basically the basics for all drugs. So this is how they're used. This is how they are delivered. We talked about how you can affect the synthesis of them. You can affect how they're packaged in the axons. We talked about the reuptake. We talked about a variety of different kinds of pathways that it can affect. So it can affect those binding sites directly. It can change the activity level through other related proteins on the cell. It can make it easier or less easy to activate certain neurotransmitters are agonists or make the binding site, that ion channel, open a little bit or a lot, or not open at all or open a lot less. So these are the ways that these medicines affect us. So I want to go through just one example. Your book has a lot of examples, but not all of them are going to be relevant to every single student. Also, to be honest, it can get pretty boring just going over the very specific things for each drug one at a time. So we'll give one example of caffeine. It's a fairly common, it's basically the most commonly used stimulant across the world in all cultures. So let's talk about caffeine as one specific example, give some general background on other drugs, and then I definitely encourage you go back to your book, especially some of these OER books have some really good like diagrams and images, and I've got some video links to share as well if you want to look into more detail and see a visual on all of these different drugs and how they are affecting the brain. So caffeine specifically is a stimulant and it's affecting adenosine receptors in the neural membrane, and it's also affecting some of our hormones in our body as well. So adenosine is a modulator. So it already modulates things. It makes it easier or harder for ion channels to open. So normally what adenosine does is bind, and then that neural activity is slowed down. So you get adenosine, it comes to this receptor, it makes the cell less likely to activate. Slows down your body, slows down your responses, makes you start to feel, say, tired, relaxed, that kind of thing. So caffeine goes and it binds to that same receptor. Basically, it makes it so adenosine can't work. It says, hey, I'm already in this parking spot. I'm already in this keyhole. I'm not turning the key, but I'm already in this keyhole. You can't sit here. You can't sit with us. You can't slow down the activity of this neuron. So it keeps being active. So the chemicals in caffeine, they bind to those same receptors. So the adenosine can't actually slow down that neural activity. Another thing it does is it activates other neural circuits in the brain. So it starts activating the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland then tells the adrenal gland to make more adrenaline. And that usually is what is leading to that feeling of having energy. So your brain is told, don't slow down, have some adrenaline, and that can also increase dopamine production. So all of this together kind of gives the feeling that you get if you've ever used caffeine. That's pretty common, so the majority of you probably have. It, rather than your brain falling asleep or getting more relaxed, it says, nope, don't fall asleep, don't get more relaxed. Also, make some adrenaline, get some charge, feel more dopamine. That'll leads to you essentially feeling more energized. So with this, most people do build minimal tolerance to caffeine, and so they might have to use more or less. We'll talk about tolerance in a little bit, in a little more detail. So most people do build a minimal tolerance for that. You can kind of get rid of that tolerance fairly quickly for caffeine, but a problem here is that it can create physical dependence, and this is one thing that's common in a lot of the drugs that are discussed in these chapters, is that physical dependence means if you stop using it, you will have withdrawal symptoms. And most people find those quite unpleasant. For caffeine, it usually starts just a couple days after you, like if I was to stop drinking coffee today, about 2 days from now, I would probably start feeling headachy, feel really weird, maybe even get like fevers, things like that. Kind of common withdrawal symptoms for caffeine. So hopefully that is a lot more clear about how caffeine works. I also want to share a video on how caffeine is affecting your brain. We talked about it, and I like visual examples too, especially since pretty much what we're talking about is at the molecular level, the shapes of molecules affecting things like neurotransmitters, hormones. So hopefully this will help make it very clear. This is a good website in general if you want to see methamphetamine, if you want to see cocaine, if you want to see ketamine, if you want to see an SSRI and what that's doing. These 2-minute neuroscience videos are pretty good. Some of them are a little older and have some older research. So look at the date. If your book says something a little bit different, go by the book. But in general, from the ones I've watched, and I've not watched all of them, but I've seen them to be pretty accurate. So let's watch this one on caffeine.
Caffeine is a stimulant drug and the most widely consumed mind-altering substance in the world. It belongs to a class of compounds known as the methylxanthines and is commonly found in a number of natural sources, including the seeds of coffee plants and the leaves of tea plants. Most of the effects of caffeine are thought to be traceable back to its action as an antagonist at receptors for a neurotransmitter called adenosine. This means that caffeine binds to adenosine receptors and blocks adenosine from binding there and activating the receptor. Thus, it reduces activity at the adenosine receptor. Although there are 4 subtypes of the adenosine receptor, most of caffeine's effects are thought to be due to its antagonistic actions at the A1 and A2A subtypes. Its ability to promote wakefulness may be especially due to actions at the A2A receptor subtype. How exactly the antagonism of the adenosine receptor translates into the effects of caffeine is not completely clear. Research suggests, however, that adenosine receptors are involved in promoting and regulating sleep. One way this is thought to occur is that adenosine activity can prompt the release of the neurotransmitter GABA, which then inhibits neurons involved in arousal and wakefulness. This promotes sleep, but when caffeine antagonizes adenosine receptors, it opposes this action and causes arousal. Adenosine receptors are also thought to be involved in reducing the activity of a number of neurotransmitters, including dopamine and norepinephrine, through methods ranging from inhibiting neurotransmitter release to affecting neurotransmitter binding. Thus, caffeine also blocks these effects, which may contribute to caffeine's stimulating and reinforcing actions.
So hopefully with that video, you see pretty clearly how the caffeine is affecting things. That video didn't go into the connections to the pituitary gland and affecting the adrenal gland, but these, again, some of the things in these videos are a little more out of date, so pay attention to your book in all of these drugs. But if you want a visual example, that's a great place to go. That channel, just search 2-minute neuroscience and then whatever drug you're wanting to look up, as well as the kind of diagrams and even like visuals in the book for all the given drugs. So with that, caffeine is the only one we will talk about specifically in class, just based on the time that we have. In your hybrid activity or your group activities or your discussion board activities, there's some different activities to explore some different specific drugs that might be a little more interesting to you or more relevant to your future practice as well. So definitely read your book chapters for more detail on all of the different drugs, review those, as well as use these other tools, these videos. I've got some other resources that I will share in the other later activities in the week for the other types of drugs too. But with that, let's get a couple basics of some of the most common things that the different neurotransmitters do. And we've kind of covered all of these things at this point in time in the class, at least at the point I'm recording this, unless I move this chapter up in the quarter. So, acetylcholine, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, glutamate, GABA, and various opioids. These are some of the most common neurotransmitters. Each of them has a variety of forms, as we've talked about, where the molecule is just slightly different and they each seem to do slightly different things. But these are kind of the main categories. So what we see here is that each of these is very related to a lot of different disorders. So we see for acetylcholine, learning and memory, Alzheimer's, muscle movement in the peripheral nervous system. For dopamine, reward circuits, motor circuits, we see it involved in Parkinson's and schizophrenia. Dopamine as well as norepinephrine are also related to ADHD. Serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine also related to autism spectrum. So norepinephrine, arousal, depression, serotonin, again, depression, but also aggression, schizophrenia, glutamate. It's a excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, and it is glutamate and GABA both are involved in a lot of processes. Again, our brain has these main categories, and they do a lot of things. The combination of them in the synaptic cleft leads to different messages in the postsynaptic neuron. So GABA is related to anxiety disorders, epilepsy, major inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. Gabapentin, if you've ever used that, say after a surgery or something like that, there's other reasons to use gabapentin, like for epilepsy, for example, or even anxiety disorders. Gabapentin is working on GABA. Uh, it seems that gabapentin, for example, is doing two things. One, it is leading to having more GABA in the synaptic cleft, but also it is modulating some of the postsynaptic neurons to be more sensitive as well. So it also seems that there's some conflicting evidence more recently that maybe in some areas of the brain it actually decreases GABA. So with all of these, there is a complex system, and that's the idea: is that each of these chemicals, neurotransmitters, some of them are also hormones as well. These are doing a lot of things, and so by affecting one, you're affecting other things in the brain. This is why other many drugs have variety of side effects. So, and paying attention to that, your book especially emphasizes watching for side effects in juveniles as well as elderly people, especially when you're using multiple drugs at the same time. These can have contrasting and conflicting effects. So, making sure that the person prescribing is aware of what else you're taking is very important. Both of the book chapters that I had you read have kind of a summary of the different kinds of drugs that we use for different kinds of things. And so this is not an extensive list of everything that we use for psychology and psychiatric conditions, but of the couple examples that I found, I think it's the best kind of overall use. It lets you know, is it an agonist? Is it an antagonist? So antagonist, again, is making something happen less or stopping it. And agonist is making it happen more. So here is a variety of the different kinds of drugs that we use, what we use them for. So you come back to this as an example in studying and looking for specific kinds of drugs. So for example, methylphenidates such as Ritalin, and there's a whole other bunch of drugs that are different types of methylphenidates that just have slightly different chemical structure but work the same way. And they are often used for ADHD. They are stimulants and they're basically blocking removal of both dopamine and norepinephrine at the synapse. So it is mostly targeting these, but again, these neurochemicals do a lot of things in the brain, so we also see other things happen too in the brain. So for any of these, it is important to be aware of how it's affecting things. Is it an agonist? Is it an antagonist? And what is the common use for these? All right, the next thing that we will focus on is addiction and substance use disorder. So most of what we've talked about right now is about how would you use these in a therapeutic way. We'll talk also about substance use, addiction, and basically everything that we've talked about so far is a good basics for understanding our understanding of substance abuse disorder. So thinking about the neurobiology of addiction, we're going to really focus on three key components and bring a lot of behaviorism into it as well. So the first thing that we will talk about is the binge intoxication piece of this puzzle, and then the negative affect and withdrawal portion, and then the preoccupation and anticipation of the drug use. So that is kind of the pattern that we'll go in. So with this, substance use disorder itself is essentially defined in the DSM-5 as uncontrolled or hazardous substance use despite negative outcomes. And so these can be negative outcomes like medical or legal issues. This could be loss of employment, estrangement from family, friends. So it's kind of a wide array of things that are considered those negative outcomes. And this is both looked at from obviously the doctor are giving you the diagnosis, whether it's a social worker, psychologist, psychiatrist, a medical professional, looking at any kind of negative outcomes and deciding, hey, does this reach the level of being substance use disorder? This is also down to a person. Like, do you feel that you are having enough negative outcomes that it would reach that piece? So, jumping into the first piece of this puzzle that your book covers is the binge intoxication phase of developing an addiction. And so this binge or intoxication period is where you're getting those euphoric effects. So those kind of euphoric effects of using any given drug, and we'll talk about the reward system in just a second. We'll actually watch a little video on it. So essentially, that reward system, having that dopamine signaling, having that network giving you pleasant feelings, is a reinforcer. And so we learn a lot from behaviorism. So basically, did we get reinforced? Did we get punished? What is associated with these things? That kind of associated learning is how many creatures and humans as well learn. So, this kind of intoxication, using drugs, basically all of them affect any kind of recreational drug we're talking about, affects dopamine signaling in some ways. So, essentially, most drugs that you're using as a um, in a non-therapeutic way, in a recreational way. That's the word I'm looking for. Recreational way. Essentially gives you a larger hit of dopamine and a more prolonged, lasting bit of dopamine than you would get from a kind of natural activation, like say cuddling with puppies or something like that. That'll give you dopamine as well. So the difference with drugs is we see that oftentimes this is a bigger shot of dopamine. It also has a longer activation, and that can, in and of itself, lead to the brain changing in some specific ways. Because of plasticity, if those are being activated, then that network that's being activated learns to activate together. And that's part of this puzzle. So let's watch this video on the reward system because essentially all these recreational drugs affect this to some degree.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss the reward system. The reward system refers to a group of structures that are activated whenever we experience something rewarding, like using an addictive drug. When exposed to a rewarding stimulus, the brain responds by increasing release of the neurotransmitter dopamine. Thus, structures that are considered part of the reward system are found along the major dopamine pathways in the brain. The pathway most often associated with reward is the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, which starts in an area of the brainstem called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. The VTA is one of the principal dopamine-producing areas in the brain, and the mesolimbic dopamine pathway connects it with the nucleus accumbens, a nucleus found in a part of the brain that is strongly associated with motivation and reward, called the ventral striatum. When we use an addictive drug or experience something rewarding, dopamine neurons in the VTA are activated. These neurons project to the nucleus accumbens via the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, and their activation causes dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens to rise. Another major dopamine pathway, the mesocortical pathway, also originates in the VTA but travels to the cerebral cortex, specifically to the frontal lobes. It is also activated during rewarding experiences and is considered part of the reward system. Because dopamine is released whenever we use an addictive drug, researchers initially thought dopamine must be the neurotransmitter that causes pleasure. More recent research, however, suggests that dopamine activity doesn't correlate exactly with pleasure. For example, dopamine neurons are activated before a reward is actually received, and thus before the pleasure is experienced. For this and other reasons, it is now thought that dopamine has roles other than causing pleasure, such as assigning importance to environmental stimuli associated with rewards and increasing reward seeking. Whatever the precise role of dopamine in reward is, the mesolimbic dopamine pathway is consistently activated during rewarding experiences, leading it to be considered the main structure of the reward system. Regardless, the actual network of brain structures involved in mediating reward is much larger and more complex than just this dopamine pathway, involving many other brain regions and neurotransmitters.
That video alluded to some main points that we'll talk about right now as well. So that dopamine pathway, synthesizing and transmitting that dopamine throughout the rest of the brain is a big key piece that recreational drugs do impact, as well as impacting the creation and the transmission of dopamine in general. It also is related to all the other structures that are part of the motivation pathway. The video also talked about how dopamine isn't just a pleasure chemical, but it's also involved in things like motivation, assigning meaning to things in the environment, helping you pick up cues. And this is all important when we're talking about addiction. So that mesolimbic, yeah, I said that right, dopamine system, while it's being activated by drugs, it does induce plasticity. When it's active, you have the capacity for plasticity, is basically the way to think about that. So that's being said, this is the way the brain works overall. If you are activating something, you have the capacity then for plasticity, to make new connections, to make stronger connections, to make new dendrite branches or axon branches. And so that's one thing that we see is when people are using these recreational drugs that give you kind of a bigger spike of dopamine in all these systems, a longer span of dopamine, it makes it maybe a little bit easier than to make a new connection, to make that network a little stronger for the pathway of the kind of euphoric feeling, the patterns of what are you doing as you are taking this drug, who's with you, what's around you, those kind of associations are a little bit easier because you have that longer lasting dopamine and a little bit more. So, with drug use, specifically recreational drug use, we see more dendritic spines developing, more synapses as well, or more receptors at synapses. So, especially in the basal ganglia, which is responsible for doing a lot of things. A lot of those midbrain structures, like we've talked about, have a lot of connections across the brain. But basal ganglia for motivation, emotion, decision making. So you're making connections there that essentially make it easier for your brain to say, oh, this was something rewarding, something good. Let's do that more. Now, this same system happens for anything rewarding. The video alluded to that too. So I've heard people say things like such and such a thing uses the same pathway as addictive drugs. It's like, um, technically, yes. Technically it does, but so does everything else. That is the brain's processes for doing rewards. So whatever that reward is, seeing a double rainbow, taking a recreational drug, playing with a bunch of puppies, riding your motorcycle, right? All of those are using that reward pathway. The specific difference here is that little bit more dopamine, that little longer effect, makes it a little bit easier for the brain to solidify those strong connections versus something like playing with a bunch of puppies, right? So, with this being said, too, this also makes it easier for us to make associations, to make connections, do associative learning with people, places, the time of day, the food you're eating, paired with a drug. Me, for example, a burger and a beer are very associated with each other, right? They just go together because of how many other times I have eaten those two things together, right? So that kind of association when using something like a recreational drug is much easier to make. So just like any other thing. Um, let's say, oh, for example, something that's not a recreational drug is going snowboarding. So when I was in high school, there was a ski resort. It was like 2 hours away, and I went to fairly regularly, so like a couple times a season. And every time me and my friends would go there, we would listen to a specific band on our way up there. I'll share what it is. It was Sum 41. We would listen to a couple Sum 41 albums on our way up to the ski resort. This was back when Sum 41 was pretty new. I think they had just released their second album or something like that. Anyway, so that was always what we listened to. And so because of that, now I have associations of those rewarding experiences of going snowboarding and Sum 41. So if it comes up in my shuffle of my songs, well, I have an association with snowboarding. And that's the same thing that happens with drugs, except since you've got more dopamine in a longer span of time, it happens a little bit more or easier, you could think of. So that's the binge intoxication piece of this. It's one of these three main pieces of the whole puzzle. So one of the things we're making connections to here is behaviorism. So if you've taken a general psych class, you've probably gone over behaviorism in a little more detail in one of those chapters. I've got quite a few slides here on behaviorism, but we're going to very briefly talk about it because behaviorism and this process of behavioral learning is a big way that humans and other organisms learn. So thinking about that, we'll talk about conditioning. There's two types of conditioning, and essentially conditioning is the term for making an association, connecting one thing with another thing. So associating Sum 41 with snowboarding, associating a specific group of people with a recreational drug, right? So you're making associations. This can happen in two ways. One is classical conditioning and the other is operant conditioning. So again, we're going to go through this pretty quickly. If you want a little more detail on that, the slides are pretty detailed. We're not going to cover everything that's written on the slides. Feel free to pause this and read them in more detail. I'm going to try to get a couple of the main basics. Classical conditioning kind of just happens to you. So you're not taking in an action, you're just learning through association by repetition. So the dog with the bell in Pavlov's dogs, it made that connection. It associated the bell, or in reality, a metronome, with the food. So in its brain, those two things are connected. The bell reminds them of food. They're connected. There are literally connections in their neurons to activate with them. The bell is a trigger for the drooling response. So again, for classical conditioning, they didn't do any behavior. They're just there. It's happening to them. Versus operant conditioning, you're an operator. You're doing something. You're active. You're engaged. You are agentic. So you're operating in some way. You do some behavior, and then you get a consequence. And so the same thing happens. You make an association, but you make an association with the consequence. Was that a good consequence? Was that a bad consequence? Will I do that behavior next time, or will I not do that behavior next time? So, thinking of snowboarding example, went up snowboarding, skipped school to go snowboarding, and thought we were going to be really clever, really slick. We were going to fill up the gas in the car, so none of the parents knew that we went there. Also, we had all our plans, and then one of my friends broke their arm, so that all went out the window. So that was definitely a consequence, right? So it changed our thinking later on. But we can do something like you could train a dog to do a task. You can train a dog to sit. You can train a dog to ring a bell. So the dog does a behavior, rings the bell, the dog sits. You give them a treat. That is operant conditioning. So you're learning an association. This good thing happened because I did this action. So classical conditioning just kind of happens to you. You learn a connection between two things. Operant conditioning, you do something and you get a consequence. So here, classical conditioning, you can have lots of stimuli that would lead to a response. So the dog example of the bell and the food, the Sum 41 and snowboarding would be a classical conditioning association there. Also, when you are using, say, a recreational drug, maybe you're using it with the same people. Maybe you're using the same tools, a pipe or something like that. Maybe you use it at the same time of day every time. So some of these might happen to become classically conditioned, be a part of that trigger system where you smell a certain smell. A pretty common one is people who smoke cigarettes. They often do it after, say, eating or with drinking or during a time of day. Oftentimes there's a lot of classical conditioned triggers of this time of day, having food it's stuck in my teeth, that can be a trigger of that classically conditioned or classically acquired learned response. So, yeah, there's some other examples here. Here's a couple interesting examples. What does this advertisement associate with you? What kind of emotions do you have? It's probably from classical conditioning. And that's oftentimes what ads try to do is use classical conditioning to get you to do something or not do something, instill fear or happiness. So look at this ad versus this ad. So this ad, you probably get a different sense. So this one's probably a lot more positive or warm, summer vibes type of thing versus the other one, maybe kind of gross or disgusting. So for this one, it probably makes you, oh, hey, that looks fun or cool. I remember a time when I was at the beach, right? It's connecting to some of your associations there. So again, this is classical conditioning, things that just happen to you. We can generalize our classical conditioned stimulus. This is basically if it's a bell, maybe we respond also to other similar bells. So if you've ever heard someone's phone notification that's not actually yours, but similar enough to yours, you might be like, oh, I should check my phone before maybe you realize that it wasn't yours. You have generalized to that stimulus. Right? So similar stimuli, we can generalize to them. So even if it's not actually the exact time of day that you usually use this drug, or there's one of the people there, but not all the people that you usually use the drug with. You might generalize to other people. And so that can be a challenge if you're generalizing and you have too many cues and triggers, might drive some of the behaviors or help to be a piece that drives some of the behaviors we see in addiction. Discrimination is the opposite of that. It's when you are focused only one specific stimulus triggers the response. So only that one tone of bell, only the one type of thing, only the one piece of drug paraphernalia is the trigger. So what's happening here is literally connections between our neurons. So these habitual behaviors, having that classical conditioning, it is just making connections. Those neurons were active at the same time, so now they're connected with one another. Again, in classical conditioning, you didn't have to act. It just happened at the same time enough that now you have that connection. Operant conditioning, again, this is when you have some kind of, you are doing behavior, you are operating, you are engaging, you do some behavior and you get a consequence. You get maybe a reward, you get maybe a punishment. So you shape your behavior over time. So we could shape a dog. So a lot of service dogs go through shaping processes in operant conditioning to do really specific tasks. This dog here learned to do laundry. So to do that, you'd first give it maybe, let's say the dog loves treats. So that's its reinforcer. So the dog is learning to do laundry. First, you give it a reward. You might prompt it to pick up clothes in its mouth. And so when it picks up the clothes, you give it a reward. After a while, after it gets good enough at that, you might want it not just to pick up the clothes, but also carry them to the laundry room. So you don't give it the reward for just picking up the clothes. You only give it the reward after it's gone to the laundry room. Then you build up on that. You shape that behavior even more. Not only do these clothes have to be in the laundry room, they have to be in the washing machine. So you get the reward after all those behaviors. So we can build a more complex set of behaviors. You can do this with chickens, you can do this with rats, you can do this with children, and you can do this with yourself as well. Train specific behaviors. So give yourself a reward for practicing an instrument. Give yourself a treat for doing some studying. You can do operant conditioning for yourself and shape more and more complex behaviors. So with that being said, this tends to happen with drug use, is that it's often a reinforcer. So the kinds of behaviors that you're doing around them tend to get reinforced from that euphoric feeling. And these dopamine systems and the plasticity make it a little easier to make that a good network. That, hey, if I do XYZ, I'll get a good result. So we use this with kids, reinforcers. A key thing about reinforcers versus punishment is that a reinforcement is just anything that makes the behavior more likely. So your consequence makes it more likely to do the behavior. So some people love spicy food, some people hate spicy food. So for some people, spicy food would be a reinforcer. For others, it would not be a reinforcer, right? So some people might really like candy. Let's say I have a sour candy. Some of you might love that as a reward. Some of you, if you did well on a test and I gave you a sour candy, you might say, yeah, well, maybe I won't study so hard next time on that test. So that's an aspect of conditioning. Again, you are behaving and getting a consequence based on your behavior. And that's what reinforcement is, versus punishment is a consequence that decreases the likelihood of a behavior. So again, some things might be punishing to some people and not to others. Right, so this is an example of yelling at a dog. That would be an example of a punishment. You're trying to decrease the biting the shoe behavior. So if we could even go back to spicy food here, spicy food for someone might be punishing, right? So I remember hearing that a parent, whenever their kid sweared, was going to put some like chili powder on their tongue. And I I don't know that they actually did that. I hope not. I'm sure some parents have done that. But that might not actually be punishing, right? If a person really likes that flavor, then that might actually reinforce the swearing behavior. So that specific thing might not actually make it less likely to happen. It might make it more likely to happen. So that's the difference between reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement makes it more likely that that behavior will happen, and punishment will make it less likely that it'll happen. And we know on average some things tend to be reinforcers, or some things tend to be punishers, but there's individual variation, right? Some dog might not like that specific brand of dog treats, so it doesn't actually reinforce them, but it's not a punishment, right? So you've got to figure that out for people. And this can happen with drug use. Punishment can happen, reinforcement can happen through the process of your behaviors with recreational drug use. All right, so think of the positive and negative aspects of this, like positive and negative reinforcement, positive and negative punishment. It's like math. The positive is a plus sign, the negative is a minus sign. So positive, you add something to the situation. Negative, you take something away from the situation. So this is often hard to understand, and I'm not going to give a ton of examples because, again, this is just a quick refresher on it. Here are some examples of positive reinforcement on the right. So Bart is studying, gets a good grade, and it's rewarding to him. It's more likely to, in the future, study because he had a positive outcome, something he liked. Negative reinforcement is, again, taking something away from the situation. So positive reinforcement, we added a grade, added maybe some praise. Negative reinforcement, we're taking something away, but it makes it more likely that you'll do that again. So house is stinky, take the trash away. You're removing a stimulus, and you have a outcome that you find pleasant. So that is a negative reinforcement. So again, the positive, negative, it's like math, plus sign, minus sign. You're adding something to the situation or you're taking something away from the situation. So negative reinforcement is often a difficult one for people to understand, but it is a piece that happens in this cycle of recreational drug use. So we'll come back to that. So here's a couple other examples. Again, positive punishment is not a value judgment. It's not saying this is a good punishment. It's saying I'm adding something to the situation that should decrease the likelihood of the behavior. So adding to the situation, hey, Bart, you have to write this 1,000 times on the board. That is a positive punishment. You are putting something into that situation. So adding something into that situation to decrease the behavior of skateboarding in the hallway. Here, you could do a negative punishment, take something away to decrease that behavior. So here, we could take away the skateboard, make it less likely that Bart will do that behavior in the future. So again, positive and negative, it can be positive and negative reinforcement, positive and negative punishment, positive adds to the situation, negative takes away. All right, there's also different ratios, schedules for reinforcement and punishment. So in general, for humans, both variable interval, variable ratio tend to be the longest lasting. Fixed ratio is really good to start learning on. Fixed interval is oftentimes we see a pattern like this. You kind of start doing the behavior right at the end. So when my kids know it's almost time when I'm going to check if their chore's done, they'll go and do their chore so that they can get some screen time or something like that. Variable ratio is one of the longest lasting. So it's number of times. Ratio is the number of times you've done a task versus interval is the amount of time it's been. So variable ratio is like about every 5 times you do this, you'll get a reward. And that's how slot machines work, actually, is through variable ratio format. So these kind of ratios are also part of making a behavior be associated a longer period of time. All right, so that was a lot on behaviorism. Hopefully it wasn't all new, but if it was, go quickly, slowly through those slides again. Just like click through them, read it in more detail, because I did skip a couple things, hoping that you've touched on this before. So we talked about the binge intoxication piece. Oftentimes that binge intoxication piece is a reinforcing piece. It makes it so your brain has more dopamine, has it for a longer period of time, making it easier to make those kinds of associations, to do classical conditioning and to do operant conditioning based on the behaviors and the rewards you're getting, which makes it so those are learned processes that stick with you a little easier than, say, getting a reward for playing with puppies. So we'll move over here to the negative affect and withdrawal phase. This is the time of someone when they are maybe reducing their positive associations with the drug. They're realizing, this does have negative impact in my life. I don't feel very good. So maybe I've got a hangover. It's not good. I'm gonna cut off alcohol for a while. Right, so it's those kinds of negative associations, maybe even withdrawal symptoms. If you've chosen to abstain or to limit, you might be experiencing withdrawal symptoms. So this is where like drug dependence comes in. So a drug dependence means that you have either a psychological or physical state of needing to use that drug to avoid withdrawal symptoms. And depending on the drug, this can be pretty quick oncoming for withdrawal symptoms. It might be a little more delayed. It might be more severe or less severe, depending on what kind of drug it is. But that's what drug dependence is. It means if you stop using this, you will get withdrawal symptoms. That would mean you are psychologically or physically dependent on it. And this is also related to tolerance. So Our liver can build up enzymes to do a better job at clearing out that drug. So the body basically learns like, hey, I know how to process this faster. So depending on the drug, the liver can do that. But we also see that neurons can change too. So neurons can get used to that level of, say, dopamine in the system to the level of that specific neurotransmitter that the drug is pretending to be or affecting, and it can start to produce less of that or like down-regulate itself. So then you need more and more of that drug to then activate in the same way. So depending on the drug, you might get the liver to interfere here, you might get the neurons to be interfering, you might get a combination of both, but that can lead to tolerance and people using more and more of the drug to get that same rewarding effect. And that using more and more, that behavior of now I've used more or I've spent more money on this, these kinds of things add to that operant conditioning. So you're getting those behaviors and you're getting those rewards. So it leads to those connections being even stronger still. So another thing here in this negative affect or withdrawal state is oftentimes we see stress. We see that withdrawing of the drug oftentimes also leads to other connected systems in the brain and the body, specifically the system that does stress. So parasympathetic nervous system to be more active. This is a cause of some of the bad feelings that people have when they're quitting. And essentially, this process acts as a negative reinforcement. So so when you have this bad feeling, when it's like you're just not feeling very good because you haven't been using that drug, and then you decide, I am going to use a little bit of it. Well, now you take away that bad feeling. You've removed the bad feeling from this and you're getting a reward. So again, positive negative reinforcement can be tough to piece out. Negative is taking something out of the situation, positive is adding. But essentially, because of that pattern, and if you're using that drug again, makes it a little more likely for your brain plasticity to make that network a little bit more solid. So, jumping to the last phase of this three-step process is the preoccupation or anticipation phase. So, during abstinence, people oftentimes experience strong cravings and become engrossed in seeking out that drug. A lot of this is down to both that classical and that operant conditioning of a person who's been using the recreational drug. So, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex are heavily involved in this preoccupation and anticipation process. So hopefully you remember and you can write down in your notes, what do the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus do? So, well, hippocampus, very involved in memory, directing where memories are, connected to emotions and other aspects of the limbic system. The prefrontal cortex does things like planning, goal setting, regulation, emotion regulation, things like that. So essentially, a lot of people have cues, triggers that remind them of that drug use, and they get that craving, right? So the time of day, the people you're with, the kind of behaviors you used to do before using that drug might now trigger your brain to go, hey, we should maybe seek out that drug to complete this pathway in the brain that we're used to, that we want. So this is some of the reason that it is so hard to quit addictive drugs, because this plasticity of the reward system makes these cues hypersalient. So yeah, they are very, very strong cues for people, right? So you might, again, going back to the puppy example, you might have positive associations. Oh, that's the room where I went and played with the puppies in the library or something like that, right? You do have some positive associations there. You had some dopamine, you have some reward networks there. But from using an illicit drug with more dopamine and a longer period of time, these cues are stronger and they are less likely to become extinct quickly. So it's really easy to activate them. It's really common to activate them. So it also, since it's changed the networks of your brain and it's involved with the prefrontal cortex, we do see people with this kind of psychological and physical dependence do have impaired impulse control. So their prefrontal cortex is not able to self-regulate as well because of some of these neural pathway changes that they've seen. And this is one of the reasons that chronic relapse is so common, because of these basic behaviorist aspects of how we learn over time. So this has really been a focus on the neurobiology. So what is happening at the brain level? How do people learn? We've got a little bit of connection with like learned behaviors and choosing to do things with the behaviorism, but this is really focused on addiction being a brain disease. And this is a neurobiology class. Of course, we're going to focus a ton on the brain and what is the brain doing. But what other factors can impact addiction? Think about it, write about it, think about your previous classes, put it in your notes. What are some things that are missing from what we've been discussing so far? And this brings us to a little piece that's only really alluded to in one of the chapters is the criticisms of the brain disease model. So this has been a model for a while for addiction, and it's really focused on the neurobiology as the cause of chronic use and relapse of recreational drugs and addiction. So it focuses on using medicine as a treatment to, if it's all focused on biology, if it's all in the brain, and we can affect those neurotransmitters, maybe we can stop it with certain medicines or patterns with those kinds of medicines and change those neurotransmitters. So there are some positives with the brain disease model, right? It has been fairly effective overall. It also led to, before the brain disease model existed, addiction was seen as just a moral failing, someone who was just not a good person because they were addicted. So in the past, also insurance wouldn't cover care for addiction. So now insurances will cover substance abuse disorder and or substance use disorder. So that is a positive as much as insurances do cover things. And it also has reduced the stigma or can reduce the stigma when people think of it as a brain disease. And that has helped more people seek treatment because they're like, oh, it's a brain disease. I'm not a failure. So I'll be more likely to go and seek treatment. You don't want to go and seek treatment if people are just going to tell you, hey, you're a failure, right? That doesn't feel good. You're not going to be reinforced. It's going to be probably a punishing event, a positive punishment in this case. Someone's adding in saying something bad about you to that situation. But there are criticisms to this model. One is that we have seen other aspects outside of just biology, just the medicine effect and help for addiction and substance use disorder. So cognitive behavioral therapy has been really good at helping people improve their self-regulation. And if they're self-regulating better, maybe they can fight some of those cues a little bit better. Also, it suggests the criticisms suggest that there is an overemphasis on the biology and that there's an ignoring of the societal or the psychological or environmental factors. Basically, the brain disease model is not holistic enough. It doesn't take into account enough of human experience and behavior. And if we're not targeting those other pieces, well, it might not be as effective. So we also see that as well as helping some people seek treatment, thinking of it from the brain disease model, it also has lowered the motivation of some people when they're told that they have a chronic brain disease. Well, what are they going to do about it? They're not motivated to try and take any changes. If they see that the medicine's not working, it's like, oh, well, my brain's broken. It's just going to be this way. We do see that as a fairly common result. But also these ignore that big learning process that we talked about. That learning process, yeah, it's heightened and it's made stronger or easier for the brain to learn these networks and make these networks really solidly because of the neurobiology. But learning is a process. You can relearn things, you can unlearn things. The learning, those associations can become extinct over time. Again, depending how long you've been using that substance, it might take longer or be harder, right? But there are more pieces to this puzzle. So it's not a bad idea. There are absolutely critical aspects of neurobiology that explain how addiction works in the brain. But I hope at this point in the class you see that while this class is a neurobiology class, it focuses on the neurobiology, there are other pieces to the puzzle, right? So this neurobiology can really explain why these kind of rewards have a bigger impact on the brain. But calling it a brain disease just by itself, it's not incorrect, but it does miss other important aspects. So human behavior, human thought, our cognitions, our habits, our experience as a whole as humans is a really complex set of systems of a lot of things working together. So both things inside us, things outside us, and to get that full picture of human experience and what goes into this person having substance use disorder, to get that full picture, we can treat more of those pieces of the puzzle. We can help make the community more supportive. We can help make an environment in a home more supportive so it's less triggering, right? We can help give additional supports so it's easier to find other help, right? So there are biological processes, and again, this is a neurobiology class. We really focus on those biological processes, but there's cognitive processes and there's socio-emotional processes here as well in this whole puzzle. So how do we treat addiction? Well, the best way to do it is through all of those methods. So the goal is to stop that compulsive drug seeking behavior. Treatments of using medication plus cognitive behavioral therapy are more useful. Another thing that we see is any other outside community, whether it's like going into the house and trying to help change things, building up systems of support in the community, all of these things help. So we do see a lot of people relapse or return to using illicit drugs after a period of improvement, but the more that we're targeting more pieces of this puzzle, the better. So oftentimes for effective treatment for addiction, at least 3 months of both the medicine and cognitive behavioral therapy are recommended. More obviously is good if you're still needing, but also talking about communication, stress management, relationship issues, right? So if one of the reasons that you're so stressed out and you sought out this reinforcing substance is because of a relationship issue, well, if you can work on solving that too at the same time, that is one piece of that puzzle. If it's vocational concerns or legal concerns, group and family therapy can be very helpful. So having other people to talk to or get ideas from, having family who might be able to more directly support you as well, and might be some of the cause of some relationship issues, for example, can help. You can get some identification, affiliation, even confrontation from these people to work on those other pieces of this puzzle. So it's also a good way to look at any other kind of mental health disorders too. So oftentimes we see substance use disorders have are twice as likely to have mood or anxiety disorders in addition. So whether the substance abuse came first or the anxiety and then the substance abuse, treating them both at the same time leads to a healthier person overall. So again, thinking about the brain disease model, it's not a bad model at all. There's a lot going on in the brain that makes this kind of a unique thing in human experience, human learning, but there's other pieces to the puzzle too to be aware of. So while we only looked at a couple specific, well, really one specific drug in this lecture series of slides of caffeine, do go to your book, do go back to the images, look at the different videos. I definitely recommend the 2-minute neuroscience videos if you want another visual example. Especially there's a couple that are talked about in your books that don't actually give a specific visual example. So looking for those as well, it's a really good way to see that. Yeah. Uh, think especially about the kind of people you do plan to care for in the future, which drugs maybe you're more interested in learning about, how do they affect things? Because each is a little bit different. Some mimic a neurotransmitter, some affect other systems around the neurotransmitters. So it's a interesting, complex system of how all of these drugs affect us. But that is it for the chapter on um, or chapters on psychopharmacology. Make sure you are checking your syllabus for what chapters we're going over next.